Well, here we are again. Mike Martin's here. With the Mike Martin's channel, rates have gone up and now delinquencies have increased by 24%. Like we've been warning you guys for over a decade now on this channel, taking on too much debt to compete with money laundering from China is economic suicide on a personal level. Wages have not been tied to real estate prices for over 14 years now in Canada. Governments have sold out to the highest bidder. In turn, this has created artificial shortages, sending the price of housing skyrocketing. Governments tried to slow this economic problem down back in 2020 by pulling the trigger on a pandemic. Please check out our 2018 video on that, titled Mike in the Night, Hot War Ahead, Trudeau Forever, They Will Pull the Trigger on a Pandemic. Canadian households are starting to understand why many experts warned against taking on too much debt. A new report from Equifax Canada shows more families are having trouble paying back their large debts. This problem is worse in more expensive areas, where missed payments are increasing faster than the national average. Unfortunately, it looks like this trend might just be beginning. Canadians have slowed down their borrowing, but are still taking on debt at a steady rate, as we have been warning on here. By the end of the first quarter of 2024, household debt had grown by 3.5% to $2.46 trillion. Most of this debt is in mortgages, making up 74% of the total amount. This is a huge burden for many people. Credit delinquencies or late payments are rising in Canada, especially in the most expensive regions. While the national delinquency rate wasn't disclosed, it is lower than it was before the pandemic. Equifax credits the mortgage stress test introduced in 2016 for helping to control the problem. However, some areas are still heavily indebted and expensive, leading to new records for delinquencies. In the first quarter of 2024, Ontario's total of delinquent mortgages, which are those more than 90 days overdue, went over $1 billion for the first time. The report also highlighted data for Toronto and Vancouver, the most expensive real estate markets. Both Toronto and Vancouver now have higher delinquency rates with a 90-plus day balance than in the first quarter of 2020, according to the report. From the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2024, Toronto's mortgage delinquency rate increased by 0.05% to 0.14%. In Vancouver, the rate increased by 0.03% to 0.14% over the same period. Canadian households are starting to see why experts warned about taking on too much debt. A new report from Equifax Canada shows more families are struggling to pay back their large debts, especially in expensive areas where missed payments are increasing faster than the national average. This trend might just be starting. While Canadians are borrowing less than before, they still owe a lot. By the end of the first quarter of 2024, household debt increased by 3.5% to $2.46 trillion, with mortgages making up 74% of this debt. This is a heavy burden for many people. Late payments on credit, known as delinquencies, are rising in Canada, especially in the most expensive regions. Although the national delinquency rate wasn't disclosed, it is lower than before the pandemic. Equifax credits the 2016 mortgage stress test for helping to manage the problem, but some areas are still too indebted, leading to new records for delinquencies. In the first quarter of 2024, Ontario's total of overdue mortgages, those more than 90 days late, exceeded $1 billion for the first time. The report also highlighted Toronto and Vancouver, the most expensive real estate markets. Both Toronto and Vancouver now have higher delinquency rates with a 90-plus day balance than in the first quarter of 2020, the report says. From the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2024, Toronto's mortgage delinquency rate increased by 0.05% to 0.14%. In Vancouver, the rate increased by 0.03% to 0.14%. When households run out of money, they usually try to keep paying their mortgage, so non-mortgage credit can give an earlier warning about financial problems. The number of people who missed a payment rose 12.2% over the past year to 1.26 million in the first quarter of 2024, the highest level since 2020. Missing one payment isn't a big issue, but the risk of default rises with more missed payments. This problem is worse in the most expensive regions, where households are moving away, as we have warned on here many times about a mass exodus of youth and young families and professionals fleeing their countries of birth. Missed payments for non-mortgage accounts increased the most in Ontario, with an increase of 14.6%, BC with 13.4%, and Quebec with 15.2%. Higher interest rates are partly to blame for rising delinquencies. While the stress test reduced the expected number of delinquencies, it wasn't enough. The issue affects not just mortgage borrowers, but also those with other types of credit. The core problem is the high cost of living and the amount households need to borrow to get by. The Canadian proper is under economic attack, as they are on the verge of losing everything. So is the Australian middle class, and New Zealand middle class, and the UK middle class. We have made several hundred videos on this topic alone, on how this problem started in 2010, and how it will unfold, and how to fix these problems today. Please like and subscribe, and if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. Mike Martin's here. I have spoken.